Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to the Officio Assassinorum mini-series. Now that we've talked about the Officio Assassinorum itself and its history, it's time to move on to the really interesting stuff. The assassins themselves, starting, as promised, with the Vindicare, the patient snipers. And do, by the way, make sure to admire the custom-made art I've commissioned for each one of the major assassin temples in this video series, along with a couple side ones as well. And if you are a supporter of mine on either Patreon or Subscribestar, you can head over there now to download a full resolution version of this artwork. So, enough shilling, let us get to it. The Vindicare Temple was, like all of the others, founded by its namesake, Sire Vindicare, one of the original 6 Director Primus, who founded what was eventually to become the Officio Assassinorum. Sire Vindicare was a sniper, a marksman of unparalleled skill and unrivaled patience. And so when the director finally hung up his long rifle, he sought to impart these virtues and all of the general skills of a marksman onto a new generation of ultra-long-range assassins. This first generation was primarily recruited by the Director Primus himself or the Master of Assassins. But as the demand for assassins grew ever larger, this became an impossible task, and eventually, with the establishment of the Officio Assassinorum as an official, proper part of the Imperium, they gained access to new resources. And these days, most assassins are chosen from amongst the students of the Schola Progenium, an organization of the ecclesiarchy that brings up the children of nobles and imperial officers who fell in the line of duty serving the Imperium. Normally, a child would go through the Schola Progenium, and eventually, he would be chosen for one of the various branches of imperial service, be it the Imperial Guard, the Navy, the Militarum Tempestus, or possibly even service as a commissar in the Officio Prefectus. In the case of assassins, however, particularly skilled and or talented children are selected at a very early age, and then seconded to the temple who requested them. And once the lucky individual enters the warm embrace of their new temple home, they are immediately put through a meat grinder of a training program, designed both to prepare them for even harsher instruction that is to come, and to separate the wheat from the chaff. On average, only about 1 out of every 10 aspirants make it through this part of the training, and by make it through, I mean survive. And assuming our young aspirant somehow beats the odds, he will have passed what is essentially the basic fitness test for the Vindicare Temple. Next up, he has to actually learn how to be a Vindicare Assassin, which is a hell of a lot more than simply just pulling a trigger. Of course, it is a rather key part, and aspirants will receive extensive firearms training, allowing them to expertly operate a wide variety of weaponry, along with all of the necessary training and theory required to engage a target at extreme ranges. And make no mistake, that is a complicated proposition. It requires a great deal of good old-fashioned mathematics to introduce a 50-gram piece of lead through rain, weather, and gravity to a target only a handful of centimeters wide. Not to mention that aforementioned target is quite frequently located hundreds upon hundreds of meters away, if indeed not thousands upon thousands of meters away. And so whilst no one should underestimate the difficulties involved in taking a shot and making it count, any good sniper will tell you that taking the shot is comparatively easy to finding the shot. I suspect that a fair few of you may be familiar with my Siege of Vrak series, and thusly you may also be familiar with what really kicked it off into a full-blown military conflict. Certain members of the God Emperor's most holy Inquisition determined that it would be best if the renegade Cardinal Zephan was removed before he could kick off a full-scale heresy, and so they dispatched a Vindicare Assassin to the planet of Rax to take care of him. Unfortunately for the assassin and the Inquisition, Zephan was more than aware that he had a fair few enemies. It was, indeed, the very reason why he had made the move to Rax in the first place, and he had taken a great deal of precautions to ensure his safety against any assassination attempts. After a long period of scouting out his target, the Vindicare discovered one possible opportunity. For a split second, the Cardinal would be exposed, relatively speaking, whilst crossing an open courtyard. And by exposed, by the way, I mean he would be behind a massive, thick, ornamental pillar. The Vindicare would have to take the shot through the pillar and strike the Cardinal just as he was passing on the other side of it. This necessitated the use of a turbo penetrator round, which would have enough force to both smash clean through the pillar without having its trajectory affected by it, and still retain enough kinetic force to ensure the death of the Cardinal. And I would like to stress that this was not an overly optimistic plan. This wasn't some insane long shot, though it was a little bit of a gamble. The target would only be, quote-unquote, exposed for a mere second or two, and the shot would have to be taken through a massive ornamental pillar. But these were not impossible odds for a Vindicare Assassin. In fact, he made the shot. The turbo penetrator round slammed into the ornamental pillar and exited out to the other side, with plentiful force to smash the Cardinal off his feet. But this is where that calculated risk, that gamble, comes into play. Because if the Cardinal happened to be wearing some form of shielding device, the turbo penetrator round would not have enough force to break through it. That would require a specialized shield breaker round. But what were the odds of that? First and foremost, personalized shield technology is absurdly rare within the Imperium, and while certainly the Cardinal was of a high enough position to possibly have managed to acquire one, it was very unlikely, and even if he did have one, why would he wear one whilst just walking around his palace, protected as he was both by dozens of guards and tall, thick walls? What possible need would he ever have of such a device in such circumstances? Unfortunately, not only did the Cardinal possess such a device, he also proved to be a remarkably paranoid individual, and so he was wearing a Rosarius when the turbo penetrator round sliced through the pillar and impacted upon its shields. And so whilst the Vindicare Assassin had made the shot, he had not found the right shot. A slightly less depressing example can be seen in the actions of Vindicare Assassin Dejedris Garamak. He was given what can only be described as an exceptionally problematic target. He was asked to hunt down a Dark Eldar fighter pilot, of all things. The pilot in question was an individual known as the Sky Knife, who had earned a fair bit of repute as a Razor Wing fighter pilot. And this presented a couple minor complications, of which actually shooting down the Razor Wing was one of the lesser complications. A turbo penetrator round will quite happily slam through the hull of pretty much any air superiority fighter. Now, of course, hitting it would be yet another minor complication, since the Razor Wings are, as the name quite clearly implies, quite nippy, but that is all taking the shot. And no Vindicare Assassin worth his salt has ever had any troubles taking the shot. Once again, it is finding the damn thing that's so complicated. And in this case, even more complicated than usual. Taking a trip to Komarog is, well, basically impossible in the first place, but, well, the impossible has never stopped an Imperial assassin before. The problem was that even if he somehow managed to get to Komarog, then what? How is he to locate a single fighter pilot in a city of God Emperor only knows how many millions, if not billions, of Dark Eldar? Not to mention the tiny little detail that Komarog is literally an impossible city, resting within the webway. And due to that peculiar location, the city of Komarog has no clearly defined limits or borders or, hell, half the time, rules of physics. Skyknife may very well be resting within a tower spire in the heart of Komarog, of which there are hundreds if not thousands that all in turn make up different portions of the Dark City. Or he could also be living the high life in some splinter realm, Komarog being not so much a single city as a vast conglomerate of minor realms and city-states. And, surprisingly, they don't have an overly well-developed tourist system, so you can't just pop down to the local booth and ask for directions either. And, of course, again, this is all assuming Skyknife is even in Komarog. He could be away raiding with his cabal for all this poor Vindicare knows. And so, in the end, he decided that no, this did not seem like the best course of options. So instead, he requested all information that could be made available about Skyknife from all possible sources. The Imperium, the Administratum, the Imperial Guard, the Inquisition, if they would let him have a peek in their records, etc., all in an attempt to find some form of pattern, to figure out where Skyknife had been and where he might eventually reappear. And whilst undoubtedly it would have taken a great deal of time, patience, and paperwork just to hand in the requests, and then to siphon through all of the various records for any mention of Skyknife or any identifiable markings, because of course, there's more than one Razorwing pilot out there, and as you can probably imagine, those currently being strafed by a Dark Eldar jet fighter may not always be taking the time to write down detailed descriptions of the craft. But, in the end, his research paid off. He managed to find a world on which Skyknife had appeared multiple times, and he also managed to figure out a general area in which he was expected to appear, based upon where he had launched his previous raids, and which areas had been struck from what directions. And, in a stroke of good luck, there was a pretty damn great position just waiting for him. A massive monument in the form of a vast humanoid statue known as the Threndian Colossus. The Jedris took up residence in the Colossus's left eye socket for the better part of 6 years, nourishing himself on the various pieces of moss and greenery growing on the Colossus and in the eye socket, occasionally supplementing his somewhat monotonous diet with the odd bird that strayed too close to his perch. I would also assume that he had at least some limited form of a support structure in place as well, because a Vindicare Assassin is, at the end of the day, just a human, and I have difficulties imagining one surviving off moss and seabirds for 6 years without suffering some pretty damn severe consequences of malnutrition. But, of course, that makes it a far less interesting story, so we shall simply hand-wave that particular part away. The important part is that after 6 years of waiting, the Jedris' patience finally paid off, as at long last, Skyknife's Razorwing materialized in the skies in front of the Colossus. Half a second later, a turbo-penetrator round was smashing its way through the Razorwing's cockpit and finishing the Jedris' mission. A bit of an extreme example, to be sure, but once again, taking the shot took seconds. Finding it took years. And so it should come as no surprise that a Vindicare's training focuses on infiltration, stealth, and subterfuge just as much as it does marksmanship. And speaking of the training, it takes place primarily in the assassin Clyde's temple, of which in the modern Imperium there are several scattered across the galaxy. The size and complexity of a temple can vary considerably, based upon its nature and complement of assassins, but they are all, universally, richly appointed with the facilities required to train future assassins, and plentiful areas for those who have already graduated to further hone their skills. The Officio is a highly valued organization of the Imperium, and no expense is spared in its operation. This gives access to not just the usual forms of training like huge underground shooting galleries or advanced servitor-staffed infiltration test chambers, but also delicate, near-forgotten hypno-indoctrination technology. When applied correctly, it can teach even a Stone Age barbarian how to disassemble, clean, maintain, and reassemble even the most advanced of weaponry. It can also help the prospective assassin learn to take complete control over his mind and body, allowing him to stay both perfectly still and perfectly focused for days on end. Unfortunately, this technology does have the occasional complication. Like, for example, it might teach the Stone Age barbarian to disassemble the rifle, but forget to mention the little detail of removing the magazine first. And it may teach an assassin to lower his heart rate to the point of complete immobility, but also forget to mention that that might stop his, body from functioning. Minor things like that. And so the temples usually prefer to introduce these theories manually, in the more traditional sense, first, and eventually use the hypno-indoctrination technology to expand upon these principles that have already been adopted. Or, in periods of extreme need, an assassin could potentially be fast-tracked through the program, but again, you're rolling the dice a bit on that one. Now, presuming, once again, our fictitious neophyte has made it through the advanced course, he will soon be ready to receive his equipment. And that is, of course, one of the best parts, when he finally gets his hands on a proper Exitus long rifle. Each and every rifle is a masterpiece of Imperial weapons technology, every one of them fashioned by a Magos artisan of the Adeptus Mechanicus to the precise standards and requirements of the assassin who wields it. The stock, the barrel, the silencer, the grip, the magazine, the scope, the barrel, even the external casing. Everything is customizable and modifiable. One assassin may, for example, have a fondness for infiltration and require a shorter, almost carbine-like version of the weapon, possibly even one that can be disassembled and broken down into its various component parts until it can be smuggled in somewhere within the assassin's own body, for example. Not an unusual trick for the Imperium's assassins, mind you. This approach may be considered a hint too risque for another assassin, who may request the exact opposite: a longer, smooth-bored barrel made for firing rocket-assisted rounds, complete with supplementary optics and telemetry to account for wind, moisture, gravitational pull, curvature, light reflection, and all of the other gadgets and doodads to allow the assassin to eliminate his target from the safety of near-bloody orbit, if he so chooses. This level of variety makes it quite impossible to speak about the Exitus in specific detail, as those details can potentially vary quite significantly. But generally speaking, extraordinarily generally speaking, generally as in orcs generally speaking, It will take the form of a long-barreled semi-automatic silenced rifle fed by an internal fixed magazine and equipped with a high-tech scope capable of gathering a wide variety of environmental data and feeding said data to the operative's spy mask, either via a wireless connection or via a direct hard-link connection feeding into the operative's stealth suit. Additionally, the Vindicare Assassin will also be equipped with an Exitus pistol, finished to the same precise and high standards as his rifle. This will be his primary and in many cases only backup piece, and if a Vindicare Assassin is forced to rely upon his pistol, then shit has in all due likelihood hit the fan at hypersonic speeds. And so the Exitus pistol is usually designed around desperate last stands or breakout scenarios, occasions in which an extended magazine and the ability to fire fully automatically can tend to come in handy. But don't make the mistake of underestimating the Exitus pistol just because it is technically a backup piece. It is still manufactured to the precise same exacting standards as the rifle, and is also able to utilize much the same specialized ammunition, just usually of a somewhat smaller caliber. It will punch straight through most personnel protection in the Imperium and beyond, and what it cannot already penetrate with a standard round, well, a shield breaker, a turbo penetrator, or a hellfire round, those will probably get the job done quite well. But of course, once again, a Vindicare Assassin should never find himself in such a predicament. Occasionally, reality dictates that he has to make the best of a situation, but he is given the training and equipment to avoid such happenstances wherever possible. And that is where we get to his next two primary pieces of gear, his spy mask and his stealth suit. I went on at length talking about how it is far more important to find the right shot than just simply taking the shot. And these two pieces of gear is what allows the Vindicare to find that perfect opportunity to fire. First and foremost, the stealth suit. This stylish, matte black full-body apparel is linked directly to the assassin's genetic code, and provides an extensive suite of support functions. The most obvious is its ability to move with the wearer completely silently, and also dampen any noises he might make as well. It is also capable of blending into the environment, subtly shifting its colors and hues so as to camouflage the wearer to near perfection. It also hides the assassin from modes of detection beyond those of the human eye. It baffles sensors and can even hide the presence of an assassin from PIC recording devices, along with being able to disguise and disperse the assassin's natural body heat, releasing just enough to blend in perfectly with the surrounding heat levels of the environment. And of course, the stealth suit also comes complete with a small drugstore of its very own, full of various wonderful chemical creations to help the assassin perform at its highest level for as long as possible, and for a bit beyond the highest level on occasions of extreme bodily crises. A frequent problem in the assassination career, as I'm sure you can imagine. The second part of the ensemble is the stylish, almost skull-like visage of the spy mask. It contains a series of advanced sensors and also a neural link connected directly to the assassin's brain. The mask is able to gather information on several visual spectrums and also gather up the data collected via both the suit and the Exitus rifle scope. It then compiles the data, works it, and modifies it in such a way as to allow this information to be uploaded directly into the assassin's own brain, making it feel as if all of this data was gathered through natural means. The Vindicare knows the precise strength and direction of the wind as if it was caressing his skin, and he knows the precise luminosity of any area in which he is in as if he was able to just see it precisely, down to the most minute measurement, allowing him to know whether or not he is exposed or perfectly hidden in the dark compared to the light in the surrounding area. This obviously aids in infiltration in a wide variety of ways, by revealing hidden laser trip beams, for example, or keeping track of guards or security systems. But the mask's most important job is to allow the Vindicare to finally take the shot when he finds it. As I mentioned previously, it is not so easy to take a shot at a target from way, way, way away, and even less so during various strenuous circumstances, like taking a shot that needs to pass through a massive ornamental pillar, for example, or one in strong crosswinds, or heavy rain, etc., etc. And the mask, along with the neural link, lets the assassin digest all of the necessary data collected by the various instruments in his suit and primarily in his Exitus long rifle scope, and then make tiny, instantaneous adjustments to his aim and weapon settings, ensuring maximum accuracy at a split second's notice. Which is more important than you might at first think. It might sound as if it's a sniper, right? They have all the time in the world to find their little perch and then just sit there waiting. They can pick off the target as he's preaching at a pulpit, perhaps, or sleeping in his bedroom and so on. And on occasion, absolutely. Not every assassination is an attempt at killing a Dark Eldar jet fighter pilot whilst he's in his craft. There are those assassinations that are far more easy than others, but in many cases a Vindicare Assassin is dispatched when a target is so on guard that the only two options are to take him out from a range that seems impossible, and so the target is not guarding against it, or sending in a full-scale invasion essentially, or never saw. A distinction without a difference really, but, well, details. And if the only window for the perfect shot is a literal window that the target passes for about 1.5 seconds on the way to his weekly prostate exam, you don't exactly have a whole lot of time to start fiddling around with knobs, or taking one last wind measurement or anything. The Vindicare needs to be able to gather all of the information he needs in a split second, then process it, and then make the adjustments before firing. And when you add in things like bullet travel time, which can take a couple seconds all of its very own, maybe the target has actually moved past the window at the point where the bullet would actually hit him, at which point you also need to take into account the thickness of the walls on either side of the window, whether or not they have been reinforced, whether or not they might change the trajectory of the bullet, and again, a bajillion million trillion other tiny little details. It may seem as if I have been downplaying the importance of making the shot in favor of finding it, but again, that is not to say that it is in any way, shape or form an easy task. It's just that the Vindicare make it look easy. And speaking of targets, I think it would be good to wrap up the video talking about what kind of targets the Vindicare are most often dispatched against, and why. I already touched upon this just a moment ago by stating that they're often dispatched against targets that are either so protected that the only way to take them out is from what would appear to a normal person to be an impossible angle at an impossible range, or alternatively, dedicate oneself to a full-scale assault. But that is not the only example of a good Vindicare target. Consider for a moment the means of assassination. It's a bullet. Just a bullet. Well, a somewhat special bullet, sure, but it is nevertheless just a bullet. It is not a raging, murderous, crazed assassin that has butchered its way through God only knows how many people to get to the target, making a pretty clear statement whilst doing so. It is not some hyper-advanced alien piece of technology that rips the target's very soul out of its body. Nor is it some apparently accidental death, like being crushed by a chandelier, or choking on a bad clam, or anything like that. It's a statement and yet also a death that seems so utterly ordinary, so normal. The demagogue got shot. Doesn't sound very special, does it? Even to his closest followers, those who would be most enraged by his death, well, he just got shot. Who did he get shot by? Well, I mean, he got shot. That's not really much of a calling card, is it? Bearing in mind, once again, that the operations of the Officio Assassinorum are not exactly public knowledge. You can't exactly just look them up on the Aquilopedia, if such a thing were even to exist. And let's take the example of a demagogue, a crazed preacher who has decided that he has seen the light. He has figured out the one and only true gospel that the rest of the Ministorum is simply too blind to see. Now, there is some degree of freedom of religion within the Imperium, as in, you shall worship the Emperor and nobody but the Emperor, but in what precise form you worship him, that's a little bit more up to interpretation. Savage worlds might see him as the sun. Ocean worlders may see him as the literal sea, a Neptunic god. And of course the Space Marines, well, there is hardly two chapters that worship him in the precise same way, that don't have some chapter-specific legends or tales about the Emperor and his divinity. Some even don't view him as entirely divine at all, adding in a little bit of realism to the idea. It was, in fact, at one point canon that the Space Marines did not actually truly worship the Emperor at all, instead viewing him merely as the foremost amongst men, although I do believe that one has since been retconned, at least to a degree, since now many Space Marine chapters outright worship him, and even during the earliest periods when his worship was beginning to spread in, say, millennia 31-32, there were already those chapters that were heading towards full-on worship, the Black Templars being first and foremost amongst them. And, of course, the biggest example of all, the Adeptus Mechanicus, who worship him in the form of the Omnisire. But I'm wandering off on a bit of a tangent here. However, if there is a member of the Adeptus Ministorum, then a lot of that freedom goes straight out the window. He is expected to preach the correct gospel, for he is not some backworld, tribal, savage, barbarian, shaman, or some local religious leader. He is a member of the prestigious order of the Adeptus Ministorum, the true church of the God Emperor. When those people start wandering off the reservation, measures must frequently be taken, for the protection and good of all, of course. And honestly, in this case, I mean, they have a point. Religious leaders in the world of 40k do have a tendency to create quite a fuss when they start thinking that Big E is communicating to them and only them. It is therefore often desirable to see the oh-so-delusional contents of the preacher's brain scattered across the local scenery, rather than remain inside of his head where they can cause no end of trouble and misery. But straightforward as this may initially sound, it is a little bit more complicated than that. If this demagogue has gathered himself a proper following, for example, seeing him killed in a fashion that can be clearly connected to the Imperium, or the Ministorum, or any other branch of Imperial government, could often have the exact opposite effect. Instead of removing his harmful influence from the board, it could instead end up amplifying it, turning him into a martyr for his cause. And we don't want that. Most empires throughout history has, at one point or another, had some experience with the creation of martyrs. And, well, it is rarely in the long-term benefit of the empire's interests. But, at the very same time, we are speaking of zealots, religious fanatics, lunatics of the highest order, and merely seeing their religious idol, their prophet, pass away through some accidental means is unlikely to discourage them. And in the worst case scenario, it will once again be the trigger for them to get properly radical. Oh, our prophet just died from a slice of bad cheese, you say? Well, that sounds mildly implausible. Are we sure somebody could not have been involved in feeding him the poison cheese? And suddenly, you're back to square one with an assassinated martyr and all that. What you need here is a pinch of fear. Just a little bit of a warning added into the assassination. Just enough to make the next guy in line think to himself, can I really hear the Emperor in my sleep? Or is it just the click-click-clack of a bolt-action rifle being reloaded? And that, of course, is where the Vindicare Assassin comes in. The demagogue is holding a speech. He gets shot. His followers panic and then rage. But who do they blame? I mean, sure, it seems suspicious, but he was just shot, and they're unlikely to have the kind of investigatory skills required to determine by whom, at what kind of range, and by what. And you can bet your pretty little ass that the Imperium's official investigatory bodies will be sweeping this one quite far under the rug as well. And so, what are they to do? Well, they could try to pin the blame upon the Imperium, if they would dare to, of course, and then maybe the next guy also just gets shot. And when you're down to the third guy in line, you can be pretty sure that he is reconsidering his career choices at that point. And once again, somebody getting shot is hardly a rarity within the Imperium, and in the case of a high-profile, controversial religious scholar, well, that's, not exactly the kind of job in which you make exclusively friends. And so pinning the blame on the Imperium and convincing other people about it, not that easy. Of course, there are exceptions to this, as we saw in the Siege of Vrax, but in that case, that was a cardinal, one of the highest-ranking members of the Ministorum in the sector, and he was located on Vrax, an incredibly religious planet with a very low Adeptus Administratum presence, and he was also executed at the absolute height of its power, or, well, see, that's also the problem. He wasn't actually executed. As I'm sure you remember, that particular attempt ended in failure, and even worse, the Vindicare was eventually cornered and killed by the Cardinal's bodyguards. And, well, whilst it may not be easy to identify from where the shot came or who took it, all of that is somewhat immaterial when you have a corpse to parade around the streets. But of course, every assassination does come with a certain risk of failure. It is inevitable. And so when high-profile targets like that needs removing, you are always rolling the dice. With the Vindicare, you are rolling a dice that is remarkably heavily weighted in your favor, to be sure, but it is nevertheless a throw of the good old-fashioned ivory. Other favoured targets include operations where the assassins are deployed for the long term, often as a part of a larger Imperial presence aimed towards a bit more of a nebulous target. For example, a Vindicare Assassin may be seconded to an Imperial Guard formation, where he is tasked with the execution of certain high-value individuals on the opposition side. But since this is an active war zone, the usual ways of the assassin must often be discarded in favour of a somewhat more offensive approach. Obviously, the tools of infiltration is still valuable, and there is still every opportunity to make a successful infiltration and assassination, but when you're fighting across a constantly moving, ever-shifting battlefield, especially against an enemy with high mobility, say for example the Eldar, the best way to actually get to your target may very well be to make the target come to you. An example of this could be a Vindicare Assassin that stays alongside the Imperial Guard elements, waiting for them to either attack the enemy or be attacked in turn, whereupon the Vindicare will actively join in the battle, eliminating high-value enemy targets, officers, and so on, in an attempt to either bring out the primary target, trying to rally his troops, or ordering some form of retreat, or gaining any kind of information as to where his primary targets may be, as whilst the dead tell no tales, the various data equipment upon their corpses... different story entirely. And, of course, if you get extra lucky, maybe, just maybe, the target is present in the group of enemies currently doing the attacking or being attacked, and by swinging the battle in the Imperium's favour, well, if a random grunt puts a las bolt through the Farseer's skull, mission complete. Oh, and of course, a third and final scenario in which a Vindicare Assassin might be chosen for the deployment is if the target is in a particularly hardened location, where getting access to the target directly is near to, or flat out, impossible, and the only option is to take him out from, as mentioned previously, an impossible range and an impossible angle. Or, once again, the deployment of one or more Eversaws, but yeah, the problem with that is, of course, the mess. All of the mess. And the collateral damage. And the mess. And the mess. Well, we'll get to the Eversaw, so believe you me. That'll be an amusing one. I feel like that episode should be nothing more than me simply just yelling at the top of my lungs, because, well, that pretty much summarizes their tactics and deployments, pretty well, honestly. But, for now, I hope you have gotten a better insight into the Vindicare Assassin. And actually, allow me to end there on a certain note. Vindicare, Vindicare. I tend to use both in different circumstances if I'm referring to a specific assassin, or to a group, or to a general idea I notice. I don't really know what the pronunciation is supposed to be, if you're supposed to pronounce the E or not. It is from Latin, and so I presume the E is pronounced, but, well, Latin being de facto a dead language... It's somewhat difficult to fully determine, is it not? And it's been quite a while since my Latin lessons. But, regardless of whichever one you prefer, I hope you've gotten some enjoyment out of this video. And so, until we get on to the next assassin, which you're gonna have to wait a little bit longer for, I'm afraid. I'm not gonna give you another double quite so quickly. And so until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for watching, and now that I know that apparently YouTube determines whether or not to push my content based upon likes, shares, and comments, I guess I'm gonna start doing the cringy shit. Please like, share, and fuck subscribing. YouTube doesn't care about that at all. Oh well, at least it's somewhat unique. Have a good day.